And breaking news in the civil fraud case against former President Trump. A New York appeals court has agreed to hold off collecting a $454 million judgment against him if he puts up $175 million within the next 10 days. Trump's attorneys had pleaded for the New York State Appellate Court to stop collection proceedings, claiming it was practically impossible to get an underwriter to sign off on a bond for such a large sum. We're going to learn more about the second court case that President Trump is facing in just a few minutes.
Welcome, guys. Adam is here. So what just happened? Trump faces a $454 million civil fraud judgment, a potential IRS bill exceeding $100 million, and came within days of having Trump Tower and his golf clubs seized, all documented court findings that are systematically dismantling the billionaire image his entire political identity is built on.
He owes nearly $500 million to the state of New York for making false declarations about his assets. Now, if former President Donald Trump does not pay up by Monday, officials could start taking his holdings.
If he does not have funds to pay off the judgment, then we will seek, judgment enforcement mechanisms in court, and we will ask the judge to seize his assets.
Properties at risk include the famous Trump Tower, valued at $100 million, the Trump Building on Wall Street at $205 million, or his golf course at Westchester, worth $30 million. For the time being, his residence at Mar-a-Lago will not be affected, but the prosecutor could also choose to freeze his accounts and seize other assets such as his helicopters. Donald Trump has implied that this is all part of a scheme to prevent him from running for president.
Let me start with the state case, because this is where the most immediate threat to Trump's real estate empire is sitting right now. A New York judge found Trump and his company liable for persistent fraud. Not a one-time mistake, not an accounting error. Persistent, repeated, systematic fraud over many years. The judgment was $454 million.
Donald Trump engaged in deceptive business practices and tremendous fraud. Donald Trump falsely, knowingly, inflated his net worth by billions of dollars to unjustly enrich himself, his family, and to cheat the system. Donald Trump may have authored the art of the deal, but he perfected the art of the steal. This long-running fraud was intentional, egregious, illegal, and he did all of this with the help of the other defendants, his two adult sons and senior executives at the Trump Organization. And so, after 11 weeks of trial, we showed the staggering extent of his fraud and exactly how Donald Trump and the other defendants deceived banks, insurance companies, and other financial institutions for their own personal gain.
That is not a typo. $454 million. And here is what makes this so terrifying for Trump. The New York Attorney General, Letitia James, was specifically prepared to move on his marquee properties. Trump Tower, 40 Wall Street, 7 Springs, the Westchester Golf Club. She had her office ready to begin the seizure process, days away.
The court, once again, ruled in our favor, and in favor of every hard-working American who plays by the rules. Donald Trump and the other defendants were ordered to pay $463.9 million. That represents $363.9 million in disgorgement, plus $100 million in interest, which will continue to increase every single day until it is paid.
That is not my characterization. That is the documented reality. James was days away from seizing Trump's most iconic buildings when the appeals court stepped in and paused immediate collection. But that pause came with a condition. Trump had to post a bond of $175 million. Notice that number. The appeals court did not say the judgment was wrong. They did not say Trump was innocent. They said he could avoid immediate seizure if he put up $175 million. That is less than half the full judgment. Even the appeals court recognized that the full bond requirement would be impossible for Trump to meet. And here is the part that should keep Trump awake at night. That bond is a conditional pause. If anything happens to that bond, if its value drops, if Trump cannot maintain it, the seizure authority snaps back into place immediately. James's office is still there. The court orders are still there. The only thing standing between Trump and asset seizure is that bond. Now let me tell you about the IRS investigation, because this is where the hidden millions framing comes from and why it is so accurate. ProPublica and the New York Times have documented that an IRS audit of Trump's Chicago hotel and tower could leave him with a tax bill exceeding $100 million if the government prevails. But here is the number that really matters. The audit would swing $364 million on Trump's tax returns. $364 million. That is the difference between what Trump reported and what the IRS investigators believe should have been reported. That is not a small technical dispute. That is a massive gap between the financial reality and the financial picture Trump presented to tax authorities. What did Trump do? Investigators concluded he likely double-dipped on massive losses. He declared the Chicago Tower essentially worthless in 2008 to claim huge loss deductions. Then he moved it to a new control entity to claim additional losses on the same failed investment. The same losses, claimed twice. That is the double dip. When you recalculate those improper losses and add in unreported income, you get to that $364 million swing. And a swing of that size produces a tax bill of over $100 million, plus penalties, plus interest. The IRS does not charge low interest rates, and penalties on tax fraud can be severe. So let me paint the full picture of what Trump is facing right now. On one side, you have the state of New York with a $454 million civil fraud judgment and the attorney general who was days away from seizing his buildings. On the other side, you have the federal government with an IRS audit that could add another $100 million plus to his tax liabilities. And here is the key that most people miss. These two enforcement mechanisms target different assets. The state judgment enforcement targets real property, Trump Tower, the golf clubs, 40 Wall Street, the physical buildings that Trump has spent decades using as symbols of his wealth and success. The federal IRS enforcement targets financial flows, bank accounts, brokerage accounts, future income, the money that moves through Trump's organization, the cash that keeps everything running. Together, they create a Pincer movement. State enforcement goes after the buildings. Federal enforcement goes after the money. There is no asset category that is safe. You cannot move buildings into bank accounts. You cannot move cash into real estate to avoid one enforcement mechanism without exposing it to the other. This is the most comprehensive, simultaneous, multi-sovereign financial accountability pressure ever assembled against a sitting president. And it is happening right now. Let me explain why the days away from seizure characterization is so important. In most legal commentary, asset seizures are discussed as hypothetical endpoints. Eventually, if enforcement proceeds, properties could be seized. That framing creates temporal distance. It makes the threat feel distant, abstract, something that might happen far in the future. But that is not what we have here. James was specifically prepared to move. Her office had done the work. The court authorizations were in place. The properties were identified. The seizure process was ready to begin, days away. Not months, not years, days. The bond posting halted that process, but only temporarily and only conditionally. The moment that bond coverage becomes inadequate, the moment Trump cannot maintain it, the enforcement machinery reactivates exactly where it left off. There is no need to start over. No need for new court orders. Just a trigger that gets pulled. That is why the asset seizure begins framing is the most accurate description. Because the seizure process did begin. It was just paused at the last possible moment before physical action. And that pause is fragile. Now let me talk about what the IRS investigation actually found, because the double-dip characterization matters for understanding why this is not just a technical accounting dispute. The Chicago Tower was a failed investment. Trump put money into it. It did not perform as expected. Under normal tax accounting, you can claim losses on a failed investment. That is legitimate. That is how the tax code works. But what Trump did was claim the losses twice. First, by declaring the tower essentially worthless in 2008 to claim a massive loss deduction. Then, by moving the tower to a new control entity and claiming additional losses on the same property. You cannot do that. The tax code does not allow you to claim the same loss twice. That is not a gray area. That is not a disagreement about valuation methodology. That is claiming a tax benefit for a loss you have already claimed. It is double dipping. And the IRS has identified it as improper. When you add up all the improper loss claims and the unreported income across the years the IRS is examining, you get to that $364 million swing. That is the hidden millions. That is the gap between what Trump reported to tax authorities and what the investigators believe the law required him to report. And here is what makes this particularly damaging for Trump's political identity. His entire brand is built on being a successful businessman, a wealthy mogul, someone who knows how to make money and manage money better than anyone else. The wealth narrative is central to his political appeal. It is why his supporters believe he can fix the economy. It is why they trust him with the country's finances. But the IRS investigation is documenting that the wealth narrative is built on accounting maneuvers that tax authorities are challenging as improper. The hidden millions are not hidden because they are overseas or in some complex trust structure. They are hidden inside the gap between what Trump claimed and what the law actually allowed. That gap is $364 million. That is not a rounding error. That is not a minor disagreement about depreciation schedules. That is a fundamental misrepresentation of financial reality to tax authorities. Now let me put all the pieces together so you understand the full scope of what Trump is facing. The state civil fraud judgment, $454 million, based on a judicial finding of persistent fraud. James was days away from seizing Trump's iconic properties. The only thing stopping her is a conditional bond that could fail at any moment. The federal IRS audit. A potential tax bill exceeding $100 million, based on an investigation that found a $364 million swing between what Trump reported and what he should have reported. The double dip on the Chicago Tower is the centerpiece of this investigation. The simultaneous enforcement. State enforcement targeting real property. Federal enforcement targeting financial flows. No asset category is safe. You cannot protect the buildings without exposing the cash. You cannot protect the cash without exposing the buildings. The fragility of the pause. The bond that halted the state seizure is conditional. If it fails, the enforcement reactivates immediately. The IRS audit is ongoing. A final determination could come at any time. When it does, the federal enforcement machinery will begin moving. This is not a story about hypothetical future risks. This is a story about enforcement processes that are already advanced, already paused at the last moment, and waiting for a trigger to resume. So what do we need to watch in the coming weeks and months? The bond coverage. The $175 million bond is the only thing standing between Trump and immediate asset seizure. We need to watch whether Trump can maintain that bond, whether its value holds, whether any challenges to the bond emerge. Any failure in bond coverage reactivates the seizure process immediately. The IRS final assessment. The Chicago audit is the most advanced, but there could be other audits. When the IRS issues its final determination, we will know whether the $100 million plus tax bill becomes an official liability. And when that happens, the federal enforcement machinery, liens, levies, seizures will begin moving. The appeals process. Trump is appealing the state fraud judgment. The appeals court could affirm, modify, or reverse. If they affirm or even modify but keep most of the judgment, the enforcement authority remains. If they reverse, that would be a major victory for Trump. But given the strength of the trial court's findings, a full reversal seems unlikely. The political accountability convergence. All of this financial pressure is building at the same time as impeachment discussions, as war policy debates, as the Epstein files release. The financial story does not exist in a vacuum. It is one piece of a larger accountability picture that is converging on Trump from multiple directions. Here is the bottom line. A New York judge found Trump liable for persistent fraud and imposed a $454 million judgment. The Attorney General was days away from seizing Trump Tower and other marquee properties. An IRS audit has identified a $364 million swing on Trump's tax returns that could produce a tax bill exceeding $100 million. The walks-out framing is accurate because when the financial narrative that defines your political identity is exposed as a misrepresentation, when the hidden millions are revealed, when asset seizure is not a hypothetical but a paused enforcement action waiting to resume, the only response is to walk out, to disengage, to try to create distance from a reality that is closing in. But you cannot walk out on a court judgment. You cannot walk out on an IRS audit. You cannot walk out on asset seizures that are one bond failure away from resuming. The hidden millions are exposed. The asset seizure process has begun. And the only question now is how long the conditional pause lasts. Stay tuned. Because the bond situation is the most immediate variable to watch. The IRS assessment is building. The appeals process is developing. And we will be here covering every development as it unfolds. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think. Is Trump going to be able to maintain that bond? Will the IRS final assessment come down before the election? And what happens to Trump's political identity when the wealth narrative is officially documented as a fraud? I want to hear from you.